Hi, I'm Captain Noor. Today I would like to walk you through how to create a dashboard from the ground up. Before getting started, you want to ask who the audience is and what you want to communicate. In the end, a dashboard is just another tool to communicate information. So the 4 steps that I'll be taking you through on building the dashboard is: 1 is to collect the data. Secondly, formulate the information that you want to communicate. Third, you want to create meaningful visuals. And then fourth, you want to construct the dashboard itself. So with that, let's go ahead and jump into our first step, which is collecting the data. So for our first step, collect the data. In our example, we have data from multiple reports to put into our data model. When I say data model, I mean nothing more than a collection of data sets connected with relationships. As shown here, we have 4 different data sets in 4 different tabs. Note the fields are pulled from cProbe, but just make sure you have the necessary fields to create your dashboard. When you download the data from cProbe, the default is CSV, but you'll lose the work if you don't save it as an Excel file. I prefer Excel binary workbook file due to the smaller file size and faster saving and opening of the file. After saving, convert each of the sheet into a table. This can be done using the short key Ctrl-T. Just make sure the checkbox next to My Table Has Header is checked. Under the Design Table ribbon, name each of the table with a descriptive name. If you don't see the power pivot in your ribbon, it can be added from your add-ins as shown here. Make sure Microsoft Power Pivot for Excel is checked. Under the Power Pivot ribbon, you can add your tables into the data model by simply clicking on the Add to Data Model icon. In order to make the connections between each of these datasets, we have to make a vector of unique values to create a one-to-many relationship between each of the datasets. In our case, the mdep variable is one of the common denominators that we can use to build relationships between each of these datasets. So let's make a table named mdep_var, short for variable. To quickly do this, go to the Data ribbon and click on the Remove Duplicate icon to make a vector of unique values. After that, add the table to the data model. Next, we can use this mdep variable table that we just created to define relationships between all of the other tables in our data model. To do this, we go under the Power Pivot ribbon, then click on the Manage icon. We can define the relationships between each of the datasets using the diagram view. I like using the diagram view because it's a visual representation of the connections you can make between each of your data tables within the data model. Here, you can just drag and drop anywhere you like that makes the most sense for you. As you can see, you can drag and drop the mdep variable from the mdep variable dataset to the mdep variable within the other datasets within the model. When you're drag and dropping, you're making a one-to-many relationship between each of the dataset as shown here. So we're on to our second step, and that's to formulate the information you want to communicate. To do this, we're going to be using pivot tables, slicers, and Excel formulas. Oftentimes, your organization is already going to have templates or standard reports, and those are often great starting points because it tells you what information you're already going to have to pull from the data sets. So let's go ahead and jump back into it. We start off by adding our first pivot table from the data model with just the mdep variable table. As you'll see later, we use this first pivot table as input to all the other pivot tables. And this is the starting point to make our information dynamic based on the input of an mdep that the user picks to review. Our second pivot table will be pulled from our resource detail table within our data model. This pivot table will serve as a reference to fill out our BOR 7 and 1 within our template. To match the format of our template, we need to put the fiscal year in the column section of our pivot table. But just note, not every mdep has data in all the fiscal years. By default, the pivot table will not show those columns, and we need to show them. Unlike a normal pivot table, when we use a pivot table from the data model, we cannot just simply click on Show Items with no data. But there is a workaround. First, we'll have to make a separate variable for the fiscal year in the data model, just like we did for the mdep variable. Once we've added the table of fiscal years in the data model, we can define the relationships between each of the datasets based on the fiscal year, just like we did for the mdep variable. So now, instead of using the fiscal year variable from the resource detail, make sure you use the variable from the new table labeled fiscal year that we just added to the data model. Now let's apply the following filters to our pivot table as shown. We'll want to use the latest position, which is the best lock in our case. We can then change the number format to make it easier to read. Don't forget we want to show all items with no data in our pivot table. To do this, right-click on the pivot table, then select Pivot Table Options. Click on the Display tab, then make sure the checkboxes next to Show Items with no data for the rows and columns are both selected. To match the format of our template, we can rearrange the rows of our pivot table for the BOR 7M1 by simply hovering over the categories and waiting for the crosshairs to appear and dragging it in the order that you want. Once we have rearranged the pivot table to the way we like it, we can start making direct references to the pivot table to fill out our template. As you can see, we were able to get the BOR N7 for FY21 through 29 and our BO1 for 24 through 29 from the Best Lock Resource Detail template. But we'll have to pull in another pivot table from the historical files within our data model to fill out the rest of the funding profile template. We'll use the same guideline as before when putting our second pivot table together. Just make sure you use the MDEP variable from the MDEP table and the fiscal year from the table labeled fiscal year within the data model. The rest of the variables will be from the historical table within the data model. In the rows of our pivot table, let's filter the BO type to just the POM funding, the PB funding, and then the executed and enacted amounts that we want from the historical files. This step is not necessary, but I also like to rearrange the rows within the pivot table to be chronological. So starting with the POM, then ending with what was enacted and then finally executed. Again, let's update the number format on the pivot table to match the rest of the template. So for FY20, BOR and BO7, let's pull that from the new pivot table we just created from the historical files. For FY20 through 23, we can use our enacted amounts from the pivot table we just created. And don't forget to show all items in your rows and columns with no data. To fill out these next couple sections of the template, we can use Excel formulas to fill out based on the information we already pulled from the pivot tables. Let's add a slicer. After adding the slicer, we'll be able to connect it to multiple pivot tables. This will allow us to control multiple pivot tables given a single user input. In our case, the input is going to be the MDEP. Notice that when I click on different buttons on the slicer, the input in the upper left-hand corner pivot table is also changing with the slicer. The other two pivot tables are not changing right now, but we'll have to make those connections so the slicer can control multiple pivot tables. To connect the other pivot tables to the slicer, just right-click on the slicer and go to Report Connections. There you can see the other pivot tables and just make sure the appropriate checkboxes are checked. Now we can check the other pivot tables to make sure it's changing along with the slicer input. One of the things I want to do for the dashboard is to have a header. So let's go ahead and make another sheet so we can put all the information that we want on the header on there. Just like the slicer we made for the MDEP variable, let's go ahead and make another slicer for the fiscal year within the POM years. This will allow the user to select which POM year they want to look at within the header information. Just like we did for the MDEP variable, we'll have to make another vector of the POM years within the POM. So we can add that to the data model and then make the connections to the other data sets within the model. Notice that the variable name isn't exactly the same. For the new vector that we just created, the variable name is POM years, but we can still make connections to the fiscal years because it's going to look at the values within the tables. Let's rearrange the slicer so it looks like tabs going across horizontally. As you follow along for the next couple of minutes, all I'm doing here is building the information that I want to display on the header section of the dashboard. The information that I want to display, I want to make it dynamic based on the input of the MDEP and also what year within the POM that we want to look at. Using an existing table that we just created on another sheet of the workbook, let's go ahead and use the XLOOKUP formula to get the information that we want to display. I'll just copy the XLOOKUP formula that I used before, but this time just change the return array for B07. Now I'm going to use a custom format to format our numbers so it shows a K at the end, just to make it obvious when people are reading that these are in K dollars. Now let's put in another pivot table to show the TOA spread between each of the compos so we can do a comparison between the National Guard, active duty, and the reserve for each of the MDEPs. Again, let's go into pivot table options to make sure we're showing all the rows with no data. Anytime we create a new pivot table, we need to remember to connect it to the slicers that we created before. Next, let's add a pivot table showing the different appropriation that each MDEP has within. Again, let's give this pivot table a name, and then afterwards we'll make the connections to our slicers. Let's connect this pivot table to the fiscal year slicer. Now let's connect the pivot table to the MDEP slicer. Next, let's go ahead and make another sheet to show the audit changes. But before doing so, we'll have to make another table of the subcycles. That way, we're able to show all the subcycles within the rows when we're making our pivot tables. You might be asking why we're creating another table with just a subcycle. This goes back to the difference between a normal pivot table and a pivot table that we create from a data model. If we're going to create a pivot table from a data model and we want to show all the values within the rows for a certain field, we'll have to essentially make a variable with all those values that we want to show all the time. In this case, we're going to be making a waterfall chart later on, and we want to be able to show all the values even if there's no data in there. And that's the reason why we're doing this. After creating a table that shows all the subcycle, let's go ahead and start another sheet so we can go ahead and make pivot tables using the audit file to show the changes in funding throughout the POM. Let's connect this pivot table to the embed slicer. And now let's connect this to the POM year slicer. Again, we'll have to go into pivot table options to make sure we show all rows without data. Now let's manually reorder the subcycles within the rows into the order that they were published. Now that we have this pivot table formatted and the rows in the order that we want, let's just go ahead and duplicate this pivot by copying and pasting for BOR and BO7. By copying and pasting the original pivot table, all we have to do is change one field now. So let's change the first one to BO7, and then we'll do BOR for the next one. Now I'm going to start another pivot table to find the starting positions for the POM. Now I'm going to select BF 1.0 as the starting position for the POM. And don't forget to give each pivot table a name. That will make it easier when we're making connections to the slicers. Now let's go ahead and connect these pivot tables to the MDEP and the POM year slicers. So one thing I just noticed is that I forgot to define the relationship between the table I made for the POM years and the data for the audit file. So let's go ahead and make that connection now in our data model. Let's go ahead and refresh the data model to make sure the connection is made properly. While we're in this page, let's go ahead and use a waterfall chart to show the changes throughout the audit files. It would be great if I could create a waterfall chart directly from the pivot table, but currently that's not one of the pivot chart options within Excel. So as a workaround, I could reference this pivot table in another section of the spreadsheet and then create a waterfall chart from that section. We also need to include the starting point for our waterfall chart. So for the start point, we'll reference the pivot table we made for BF 1.0, and then the endpoints should be the sum total of the starting point and the deltas in funding from each of the subcycles. Now I'll go ahead and repeat this process for BO7 and BOR. So we're on to our third step, and that's to create meaningful visuals. During this step, we want to make sure we pick the correct visuals for the information we want to convey. Some of the visuals we'll be going over includes a waterfall chart. These charts are great to show an audit of changes over a specific period of time. The next one is going to be a cluster column chart. These charts are great to show a comparison of different categories over time. And then we'll use line charts to show trends over time. Donor charts are also good to show proportions between different categories, and then we'll use simple text to hone the audience's attention into one or two different data points. So let's go ahead and get started on our first visual. Now let's go ahead and start with our first visual. I should now be able to make a waterfall chart from the tables I just created. The start and end points of the waterfall chart will need to be identified by right-clicking and then set as total. Next, let's go ahead and change the positive increases to green and then the negative decreases to red. And since I'm already showing the data labels, I don't need the vertical axis, so let's go ahead and turn that off too. By using green and red to show the increases and decreases, it should be intuitive enough, so the legend is not necessary. Let's go ahead and turn that off to clean up this chart. Now that I have the chart formatted the way I like it, I'm going to duplicate this chart for BO7 and BOR by simply copying and pasting, then changing the selected data. Using this funding profile template that we already created, I'm going to use this data in the table to go ahead and insert a clustered column chart. Let's go ahead and just filter this chart down to the BO1, 7, and R, and also the execution. Again, to clean up this chart, let's go ahead and remove the vertical axis since we already have the data labels. And let's turn off the grid lines while we're at it to clean up the chart even more. Let's go ahead and select the data on the funding profile table again. But this time, let's insert a line chart. That way we can show the trend of the funding levels. Now I'm just going to filter the data to just the percent funded levels. And just like I did with the other charts, let's add the data labels, and then with the data labels we don't need the vertical axis anymore, so we'll remove that too. The title of the chart should be self-explanatory, therefore this legend is unnecessary. We're going to duplicate this chart using copy-paste to make another line chart to show the trend in execution. Now we're on to our last and final step of constructing the dashboard. As with any good design process, the form should follow the function. Notice how we started with gathering and building the information we wanted to communicate. Then we started building our visuals. And finally, with our last step is constructing the dashboard itself. A good starting point to build a dashboard and of constructing the dashboard is to find online templates, or what I recommend is actually drawing it out on a piece of paper or whiteboard, just so you can get a good rough estimate of how you want to lay out your dashboard. So once you have that, let's go ahead and jump into making our dashboard. All of the information that we want to display on our dashboard has already been built at this point. So now it's just a matter of referencing that information within the workbooks. For majority of the text that we want to display, we're going to be using this text box object and then referencing the cell within the workbooks. Let's start with the title. Again, we're going to be using the text box object. In this case, we'll just type in the title. This is the tedious part of the process, formatting and making sure everything's aligned. Again, with the colors and the format and the layout, that's really up to your preference. For this text box, we want to reference whatever is shown in cell G2, shown right here. This should be the MDEP and then the MDEP description, dynamically linked to the pivot tables or the slicers. For this next text box, I want to inform the user what the current position this dashboard is based from. Let's use this section to show the appropriation that's within each MDEP. Just to cover the cases where the MDEP has more than one appropriation, we're going to go ahead and reference a few more cells underneath what's shown here. That way, when we have an MDEP with multiple appropriation, it's going to go ahead and display on our dashboard. Something kind of fun to do on the dashboard is inserting icons that kind of represent what you're trying to inform people. In this case, we're going to try to pick an icon that best represents our BOR. As you can see, all we're really doing is referencing information that we've already built within the header tab of our workbook. So go ahead and repeat this process, and this is what you should see in the header. Again, a lot of it is very tedious, is formatting, moving objects, and making sure they align, but this is how it should look in the end. Let's go ahead and move our slicer that we made for the palm years to our dashboard. Next thing I'm going to do here is format the slicer so it could fit into the background to the theme of the dashboard that we've started. To do this, I can go ahead and click one of the existing formats, duplicate it, and modify it from there. Before changing the colors within the style of the slicer, let's go ahead and grab and capture the colors that we want. An easy way to do this is just to use the snip tool. Then open it in Paint. Within Paint, you should be able to use the color picker tool. Let's try to match the color of the background behind the slicer. Then copy this hex code. Using the hex code we just copied, let's go ahead and update the slicer so it blends into the background. I'm just making sure the information on the header is updating based on the input I select on the slicer. Next, I'm going to copy over the pivot table with just the mdep variable to our dashboard. This should allow the user to select different mdeps as input for the dashboard. Make sure Preserve Cell Formatting on Update is selected. To update the style of this pivot table to match the rest of the dashboard, I'm going to use the snip tool, then open the image in Paint to use the color picker to pick the colors that I want to format the pivot table to. Notice here how I can't duplicate or modify the blank design for the pivot table. However, I can just click one of the ones with the minimal designs and just clear all the design elements and work from there. Now we have a pivot table that looks like a search bar that the user can use to input the MDEP for the dashboard. Now I'm going to just copy over the slicer for the MDEP over to our dashboard. Just like I did for the Palmier slicer, I'll update the formatting for this slicer to match the rest of the dashboard. Let's remove the display header on the slicer. We're going to use this block to display the MDEP narrative. I also want the title of the MDEP narrative to be dynamic depending on the input of the MDEP that the user picks. Let's format this cell to show MDEP narrative : whatever MDEP is shown on this pivot table. Now I'm going to use the XLOOKUP formula to pull the MDEP narrative based on the MDEP we have selected. I'm going to merge these group of cells and use it as a section to display the MDEP narrative. Now you may be asking why I don't just use a text box and reference the MDEP narrative that's in our other tab. The reason is, if you use a text box, there's a text limitation, and a lot of our MDEP narratives are a lot longer than that limitation. I'm going to use this next section to show the proportional spread between the three combos. This might be a good use case for a donut chart. Now there is a pivot chart options to make a donut chart directly from this pivot table. However, just purely for aesthetic reasons, I don't like the fill buttons that are shown. So what I'm going to have to do is just reference this pivot table into another section on the spreadsheet, and then from there I'll be able to make a donut chart. After creating the chart, I can go ahead and cut and paste this into our dashboard. The rest is just removing the background fill and then reformatting the chart to fit the dashboard. We'll repeat this process of copying over the charts into our dashboard. At this point, most of the work has already been completed, where all we're doing is copy and pasting the charts that we've already created onto our dashboard, and then the remainder is just formatting and rearranging the charts to fit our dashboard. In the end, your dashboard should look something similar to this. We made this dashboard dynamic by allowing the user to input the MDEP, and the dashboard should update depending on what the user input is. And finally, it's also dynamic depending on the POM year we select. So let's go ahead and check that. So that concludes my training. Dashboards are a great way to showcase the most important information that you want to communicate to your organization. I hope you can use some of the tools and methods that I showed you today to make your own dashboard in the future.